So, have you ever really stopped to think about where you actually begin?
On where the rest of the world ends.
Exactly. Yeah, it feels pretty obvious, doesn't it? Like, here I am, there's the chair.
Right. Seems clear-cut.
But what if that boundary, isn't quite as solid as we assume? This deep dive, we're really going to unpack that fuzzy line between self and non-self.
Mm-hmm.
We've pulled together some really fascinating ideas from different places, philosophy, literature, even some, ancient wisdom traditions. We're going to dig in.
And what's really interesting is just how many different ways people have approached this basic question of who am I?
Right.
We'll be touching on Eastern ideas, Western thought, how our interactions shape us,
Mm-hmm.
even how we sort of try on different selves in art.
Yeah, exactly. And for you listening, maybe you want to get your head around some pretty big ideas, but, without getting totally lost in jargon or overly academic stuff.
But we try to keep it accessible.
That's the goal. We're looking for those aha moments, the kind that just make you tilt your head and see things a bit differently.
Hopefully.
So today, the big questions we're asking are things like, is there actually a real fixed you in there somewhere? Can we ever truly, truly know ourselves? Or, for that matter, another person?
And does figuring out who we aren't, the other, does that help define who we are?
These are huge questions.
They really are. And thinkers have wrestled with them for centuries. We'll look at the Buddhist concept of Anattā, this idea of not self.
Okay.
We'll touch on maybe Confucian ideas about how relationships define us, Simone de Beauvoir's take on how we need the other to become ourselves.
Right.
And also some more contemporary stuff like Janardan's ideas about how selfhood might come from just engaging with the world, immersion, coordination.
Okay, let's dive right in then. Let's start with a perspective that really flips the script on how we normally think about ourselves.
The Buddhist idea.
Yeah, the idea that this solid, independent self we feel inside, it might actually be an illusion.
It's a radical idea for many.
It is. Our source, al-Bahari, talks about the self we tend to cling to. We think of it as, separate, lasting through time, definitely in control.
The boss inside.
The boss inside. And the owner of all our experiences, always chasing the good stuff, running from the bad.
And the core insight with Anattā, the not-self idea, isn't just like denying a soul in a simple way. It's really questioning that deep feeling we have of being a stable, unchanging I that's somehow separate from all our experiences.
Right.
Al-Bahari points out we build this personal narrative, this identity, right? And that creates the boundary, this is me, that's not me.
So the illusion isn't necessarily the experience itself, but the idea of a fixed owner behind the experience.
That's a good way to put it. The idea is that what we perceive as our solid I might be more like a constantly shifting process. A collection of experiences, thoughts, feelings, always in flux.
We often think of ourselves as this, single viewer inside watching the movie of the world.
The homunculus in the head.
Yeah, but the Buddhist view says that feeling, that sense of a separate, permanent watcher, is actually what causes suffering. Dukkha.
Right. The clinging to that illusion.
And so the path to liberation, to nirvana, involves seeing through that, experientially understanding this no self.
It's a profound shift in perspective. If you connect this to, say, a lot of Western thinking, which often really emphasizes the individual, the autonomous self.
Totally different.
It's a very different model. It pushes towards a much more interconnected view of existence.
And that interconnectedness leads us nicely into this idea of the relational self. Now, our sources today don't dive super deep into Confucianism specifically, but we can definitely bring it in here as a contrast to that isolated view.
Yeah, it's a useful counterpoint.
Confucian thought really stresses how much our identities are built from our roles in relationships. Being a son, a daughter, a friend, a colleague.
These aren't just hats you wear.
Right. They're not just things you do, they're fundamental to who you are in that worldview.
Exactly. And Simone de Beauvoir, even though we don't have direct quotes here today, her whole philosophy resonates with this.
In what way?
Well, she strongly argued against the idea of an isolated ego, that we're born fully formed. She believed our sense of I-alike really develops through our encounters with others.
So we need other people to know ourselves.
In a way, yes. We understand who we are, partly by seeing ourselves reflected in others, by recognizing them and being recognized by them, the other, as she termed it. It's like needing a mirror. Others are that mirror for our self-concept.
Okay, that makes sense. It's not just internal navel-gazing.
Not at all. It's interactive.
And this idea, this intersubjectivity, or our sense of self, comes from shared experience. This seems really key.
It is. And Janardan Gunn, who we mentioned, talks about this using terms like immersion and coordination.
What does that mean practically?
It suggests our sense of being a self isn't just cooked up inside our heads. It's constantly being shaped and tuned by how we engage with the world, how we coordinate with others, how we're immersed in situations.
So me isn't just internal, it's also about how I interact out there.
Precisely. Dynamically formed through that interaction.
What's really striking is how these different lines of thought coming from such different places.
East, West, ancient, modern.
Yeah, they seem to be circling around a similar idea that the boundary between me and not me is maybe blurrier than we think.
Definitely less rigid. And the phenomenological perspective hints at this too. Thinkers like Sideritz, Compson, Zahavi, they question that sharp divide we usually make between our intersubjective world and the objective world out there.
Phenomenology, that's about focusing on direct experience, right? How things seem to us.
Exactly. How things appear in consciousness before we layer on too many concepts.
Okay. And Zahavi talks about the subjectivity of experience as an immanent stream self. That sounds dense.
Huh. It does a bit. But the idea is maybe there isn't a separate you're watching the stream of consciousness, like sitting on the riverbank.
Okay.
Instead, that feeling of mindness, of being an I, is actually a quality of the stream itself. It's inherent in the flow of experience.
Like wetness isn't separate from water, it's just what water is.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah.
The feeling of subjectivity is intrinsic to the experience, not something standing apart from it.
Huh.
And some traditions, like Yogacara Buddhism, suggest that through deep meditation, you can actually reach a state where that subject-object split seems to dissolve entirely.
Wow. A non-dual awareness.
A much more profound level, yeah.
So if our sense of self is this fluid relational thing, how does the idea of the other fit in? Defining ourselves by what we're not. Does that play a role?
It certainly seems to. We often understand things by contrast. Defining ourselves against an other can be part of how we form an identity.
But that sounds like it could be problematic, too.
It definitely can be. And that's a crucial point. While it might be a natural tendency, defining ourselves too rigidly in opposition to others can lead to exclusion, to drawing hard lines.
Us versus them.
Exactly.
Right.
Creating potentially harmful boundaries.
And that connects to Martha Nussbaum's work, doesn't it? She looks at those social contract theories.
Right, the idea that society is like a deal between rational individuals for mutual benefit.
And she points out that these theories often define who gets to be in the contract, who counts as part of the we in pretty narrow terms.
Yeah, usually based on rationality, independence, the ability to contribute in a certain way.
Which can leave people out.
It can. Nussbaum argues it can marginalize those who don't fit that specific mold, non-human animals, for instance, or people with significant cognitive or physical disabilities.
So within those frameworks, those seen as other might not be viewed as fully equal subjects of justice.
Potentially, yes. Their needs might only be considered indirectly, maybe because the contracting parties care about them, rather than because they have inherent rights as subjects of justice themselves. She specifically critiques someone like John Rawls on this point, arguing his theory struggles with the status of dependence.
That's a tough critique. But then there's a flip side too, right? Beauvoir argues that interacting with diverse people actually enriches everyone.
Yes, absolutely. Nussbaum discusses Beauvoir's point about inclusive education, for example. The idea is that bringing people with different abilities and experiences together doesn't just benefit those traditionally excluded.
It benefits everyone.
It broadens everyone's understanding of humanity. By engaging with difference, we get a richer, less narrow view of what it means to be human. It challenges our assumptions.
So knowledge isn't just abstract ideas. It's really about how we engage with the world and, crucially, with each other.
Exactly. Considering these perspectives on self and other forces us to question those boundaries we might take for granted.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit. How does this play out in art, in performance? This blurring of self and other.
Oh, that's a fascinating area. Think about Aristotle, way back in the Poetics. He talked about poets creating characters, imitating others, like Homer embodying all those different voices in the epics.
So the artist kind of steps into another's shoes.
In a sense, yes. And Camus really explores this with the actor. He sees the actor as someone who, for those few hours on stage, becomes someone else.
They completely embody another being.
Yeah, it's the idea. The lines of their own self blur, maybe even vanish temporarily. Camus calls it a kind of A marvelous life unfolding on stage.
A marvelous life. I like that. It's like existence condensed into that performance.
He describes the actor as a traveler in time, even a hunted traveler, pursued by souls. It really captures that feeling of taking on other identities, the fluidity of it all.
That image of being pursued by souls. Wow. It suggests the self isn't this solid fortress.
Not at all. And if an actor can convincingly become someone else, even for a short time, well, what does that say about how fixed our own everyday sense of self really is?
It raises questions, definitely. Okay, one more angle before we wrap up. Camus and the absurd.
Ah, yes. The absurd.
He saw it as this fundamental clash, right? Between our deep human desire for meaning, for clarity, for answers.
And a universe that just doesn't seem to offer them up. A silent, irrational world, in his view.
So the absurd isn't the world itself or us, but the tension between the two.
Exactly. It's that confrontation. And recognizing this absurdity, this feeling that things don't neatly add up, paradoxically, it can clarify our existence.
How so?
By facing it, we understand our place within a finite reality without comforting illusions. It brings things into sharper focus, perhaps.
And Camus suggests living with the absurd means kind of rejecting those prepackaged meanings, embracing the present.
Yes, living in revolt against the absurdity, finding value in the struggle itself in the here and now, rather than hoping for some ultimate justification.
So how might that connect back to the boundaries of the self?
Well, you have to wonder. If we accept that the world doesn't provide a fixed meaning or purpose for us, maybe that also frees us from the need for a rigidly defined fixed self.
Ah, interesting. If the external framework isn't solid, maybe the internal one doesn't need to be either.
Perhaps. Is our constant search for a solid, unchanging Iwar partly a defense against that feeling of meaninglessness or chaos? Maybe accepting the absurd also involves accepting a more fluid, less defined sense of who we are moment to moment.
That's a lot to think about. Okay, let's try and pull these threads together. We've covered a lot of ground.
We really have, from Anattā.
The Buddhist no-self idea,
Yeah.
to relational views in Confucianism and from thinkers like Beauvoir.
The phenomenological takes on consciousness, intersubjectivity.
And even how identity shifts in art and performance and the implications of the absurd.
Yeah.
It really does seem that this boundary we usually assume between self and non-self is, well, it's much more porous, maybe more constructed than we tend to think day to day.
I think that's a key takeaway. What's really striking is how often these very different traditions across time and culture seem to converge on a more interconnected understanding.
Right.
That our identities aren't firmed in isolation, but are deeply woven into our relationships, our interactions with the other, with the world. That theme just keeps popping up.
Yeah. So for you listening, maybe just take a second today or later on and notice, when do you feel that really strong sense of me, that core I? And when does that feeling seem to, I don't know, soften, blur, connect more with the people or the environment around you?
Just observing that boundary or lack thereof.
Yeah. Thinking through these different lenses, no self, relational self, performative self, might it just give you a fresh angle on your own experience?
And maybe that leaves us with a final thought to chew on.
Go for it.
If this self is more fluid, more relational, less fixed than we usually assume, what does that actually mean for how we approach things like connection with others or empathy?
Or even our own sense of purpose.
Exactly. If it isn't just this isolated bubble, but part of a larger web, what does that change about how we live, how we relate, how we find meaning in the world?
A deeper understanding of our place within that web, perhaps. Lots to think about.